This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight, who's Ian Stone from King's. Ian is studying for a PhD with David Carpenter and with Caroline Barron, who's here. Are you?
I'd like to claim it, but I'm
you're just a friend, okay. With David Carpenter anyway. And his thesis is on the book of Arnold Fitz Thedmar. And Ian is now a Thornley Fellow of the Archers, one of the Thornley Fellowship this year, which is one of the Archers suite of fellowships, so we're very pleased about that. And I'll say so as the chair of the Thornley Committee.
Oh, very good.
So we're very pleased to welcome Ian, and he's going to talk, as you can see, on Arnold Fitz Thedmar, an early chronicler of London. Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for inviting me here this evening. I've been looking forward to this since I was invited. As Matthew said, and everything is there, my name's Ian Stone. I'm a postgraduate research student at King's College London, and from today a junior research fellow at the IHR. For my PhD thesis, I am preparing a new edition of one of the most extraordinary manuscripts of the 13th century, the Book of Arnold Fitz Thedmar. Arnold is most famous as the author of a chronicle, which accounts for about half of the book's folios. This chronicle is called the Chronicle of the Mayors and Sheriffs of London. As a chronicle written by a secular civic author, it is the first of its kind in the British Isles. In the wider perspective of European civic chronicle writing, Arnold takes his place very much alongside the likes of Jacopo in Genoa and Gottfried Hagen in Cologne. The chronicle spans the years 1189 to 1274, covering some of the most dramatic events of the 13th century. From 1257 onwards, it is the original autograph of the author, and from the death of Matthew Paris in 1259 until 1274, when Arnold died, it is, along with Thomas Wykes, the most comprehensive and fullest chronicle source that we have of the period. There is, however, much more to Arnold's book than just this chronicle. Arnold was a man of extremely wide interests, and his book shows it. It contains a skillfully compiled, detailed history of Europe, copies of assizes and statutes, lists filled with names of popes, emperors, kings, bishops, sheriffs and mayors, a history of Arnold's family. There are even 2 songs. And yet, despite the originality and the importance of Arnold's book, it has never been properly edited. The manuscript is kept at the London Metropolitan Archives, where it is known as the Liber de Antiquis Legibus, the Book of Old Laws. There is, however, no evidence that it was known by this name in the 13th century. This is the title page, and that's the Antiquis Legibus Liber, but that's a 14th century hand. Nowhere in the book is there any evidence that in the 13th century it was known by this title. In the 19th century, 2 editions of the manuscript were produced, neither of which are satisfactory. The first was published by Thomas Stapleton in 1846. Stapleton was an editor of some previous renown. His transcriptions were generally sound, and he did at least consider material throughout the book. However, he selectively discarded material that he found unimportant. He provided no apparatus or index, and unfortunately, his introduction betrays all the signs of the madness that was to kill him within 3 years of finishing his edition. Caveat Editorial. The second edition was produced by Henry Riley in 1863. Riley was a brilliant prize-winning Latinist. He taught classics at the City of London School, just down the road from us here, and he translated numerous classical works into English. Later in life, he took up editing, producing editions of London's great custom halls and other chronicles for both the Rolls series and other publishers. As this slide shows, Riley was an exceptionally busy man. In 1859, he published Liber Albus. Then in 1860, these 2 volumes of Liber Customarum. In 1861, he translated Liber Albus. In 1862, the glossary and appendices to Liber Albus. So in 3 years, that's a foot of printed material. In 1863, he did an English translation of material from Arnold's book and material from the French Chronicle of London. 1863 to 76, he did the Chronica Monasteri de Sancti Albani, which includes Rishanger, Walsingham and Howe. In 1868, Memorials of London and London Life. As we can see, in a mere 17-year period, Riley managed to edit and translate 19 volumes for publication. And this was alongside his work from 1869 inspecting the archives of municipal corporations and Oxford and Cambridge colleges for the Historical Manuscripts Commission. Riley was a very busy man, and unfortunately his edition shows it. For his edition of Arnold's book, he produced just an English translation, not a Latin text. There was no attempt to properly analyse the material to hand, and his judgments were all rather simplistic. Riley also selectively reordered the material for publication, without making it explicit, nor explaining his methodology. Moreover, he discarded even more material than Stapleton did, although here at least he did explain why. This is from Riley, there is some other matter inserted in various leaves of the Liber de Antiquis Legibus, of less interest and little or no value in a historical point of view, which he then lists, and a few other memoranda of an unimportant nature, all of which have been omitted in this present translation as having been evidently inserted in the volume for the private use of the compiler in the way of general reference, and not being in any sense illustrative of the history of the City of London. Among this material of little or no value in a historical point of view was a copy of an oath sworn by rebel barons and the Londoners in 1264, about which I have recently written in English Historical Review, evidence of a well-developed system of manuscript circulation among a London literate community, both lay and religious, and one of only 2 contemporary copies of the Statute of Marlborough, hardly material of little or no interest to the historian. As a third-year undergraduate at King's, I was fortunate enough to study the period of baronial reform and rebellion under David Carpenter. Arnold's attitudes towards the conflicting parties were the subject of my third-year dissertation. I recall once, whilst in a conversation with David, him saying, almost wistfully, "It's such a shame there's never been a proper edition of Arnold's book." That was the seed for the PhD thesis, and here I am 3 years later trying to do Arnold and my supervisor justice. For my thesis, I will prepare an edition containing all the material within Arnold's book. This will be a first. Alongside this complete text will be an apparatus and a detailed commentary. I have already made some new discoveries about Arnold's method of composition, his choice of source material, and the manuscript for later use and circulation. These will be discussed in the full introduction that I am currently writing. What I shall also do this year, with the support of the IHR Fellowship, is study Arnold's place in the genre of civic chronicle production across Europe. Arnold was the first layman in the British Isles to sit down and both compile and compose such a work, and yet for too long the true value of Arnold's book has been obscured by the inadequate nature of the 2 printed editions. I hope that my edition will place Arnold in his rightful position, both in the context of chronicle writing in Britain and in Europe, as well as in the literary culture of London. What I should like to do tonight, however, are 2 things. Firstly, I should like to introduce you all properly to Arnold Fitz Thedmar and his book. Secondly, having sung the praises of Arnold as a writer and of his chronicle as the fullest and most comprehensive source that we have after the death of Matthew Paris, I should actually like to discuss certain things that Arnold does not say. In particular, I want to discuss 4 incidents that occurred in the years 1263 to 4 and ask the question, why did Arnold not mention these at all in his chronicle? It's at times like this I wish I had a picture of Arnold to show you. Fortunately, I don't. What I can show you, which may not be as good, is his handiwork. This is Arnold Fitz Thedmar's own hand, and what he has written here is his family's history. We might not have an image of Arnold to conjure with, but from this 750-word source, we learn an awful lot about him and his family. This account begins with Arnold's maternal grandparents, Arnold of Groningen and Oda, who came to England from Cologne to pray at the tomb of Thomas Becket in Canterbury for a child. After praying at Canterbury, they decided to visit London, of which city, so noble and famous, they had heard report of in their own land. In London, Arnold and Oda discovered that her prayers had been answered and that she was pregnant. Fearing to travel, they decided to stay in London. Oda bore a son, whom they called Thomas in honour of the saintly intercession. Thomas was a sickly child, so his parents remained in London, where they had another child, this time a daughter called Juliana. In the meantime, Oda's own mother died, and now with no particular reason to return to Germany, they bought a house in London and became citizens. Their son Thomas died on crusade in 1203 or 4. Juliana, on the other hand, stayed in London and married a citizen of Bremen called Thedmar. Thedmar and Juliana had 6 daughters and 5 sons, of whom 4 daughters and only 1 son, Arnold, made it to adulthood. Arnold writes he was born at 3 p.m. on the 9th of August 1201, before further adding that all his adult sisters married important people in London, and that from these marriages sprang an innumerable even progeny of children and grandchildren. Being the youngest son of 5, it seems quite possible that Arnold was destined for an ecclesiastical career, although his book offers little indication of such a calling, nor indeed an attachment to a particular religious house. Presumably he acquired his knowledge of Latin at one of London's grammar schools, but again this is unclear. His first known appearance in the voluminous records of 13th century society comes in 1245. When acting in an under-fire municipal capacity, he destroyed a house full of ribalds. In 1251, he witnessed a settlement between merchants of London and Lubeck as Alderman of the Germans, and he appears again with this title, and this probably describes a position as representative of the German merchants in London in 1260. In the Easter term of 1253, Arnold was one of the chirographers of the Jewish Archive, and in 1266, Arnold was one of many Londoners ordered to ensure the safety of London's Jews. At some point between 1253 and 1258, he became Alderman of Billingsgate Ward, and in 1264, when the baronial rebels held London against the king, Arnold was one of the aldermen responsible for administering an oath of loyalty to the baronial cause. In 1265, following the Battle of Evesham, Arnold was almost certainly locked up by the king in Windsor Castle. The Londoners had generally been on the side of Simon de Montfort and the reformers in the recent civil war, and in Arnold's own chronicle we read that 40 leading citizens were summoned under safe conducts to Windsor to treat of London with the king. When they got to Windsor, the safe conducts availed them nothing, and they were detained in the castle for a fortnight. There were no more than 24 aldermen in London at this time. It seems inconceivable that Arnold, as one of these aldermen, was not one of the 40 leading citizens who went to Windsor. To digress briefly, perhaps it was there that one of the songs I showed you at the start of this presentation, The Prisoner's Prayer, first acquires special significance for Arnold. Here it is again. Now, I'm not going to sing this, so don't be alarmed, but the lyrics, Jesus Christ, true God, true man, take you pity on me, cast me from this prison where I am wrongfully thrown, I and my other companion, God knows the truth of it, all for another's mistake are delivered to shame. One can well imagine Arnold languishing in Windsor Castle, consoling himself with what may have been a widely known song of the time. Certainly it's easy to imagine how a song like this could have taken on a special resonance for Arnold after a period of imprisonment. To return to our theme, however, it seems that Arnold was soon released and back in both royal and administrative favour. In 1270 he had possession of the chest containing the city charters, suggesting that he may have had some office similar to that of city chamberlain or town clerk. Now, Arnold never held shrieval or mayoral office in London. Nevertheless, it's clear that up until his death late in 1274 he was an important man about town. He was also one of the richest. In his will, Arnold bequeathed substantial property to his widow, Agnes, and to his nephew, Stephen Eswe. When excavations were undertaken as a part of the redevelopment of London Cannon Street Station, Derek Keane used this will to draw some fascinating conclusions about Arnold's main residence. Here is his sketch of Arnold's property. This is Arnold's property, the horizontal shading. This shows that Arnold's house was of considerable size, containing 5 shops under the Thames Street frontage, behind which were a group of cellars used as a tavern, a kitchen next to Windgoose Lane, and a wharf on the river. We cannot be sure as to how Arnold acquired such obvious wealth. Doubtless he inherited a not inconsiderable amount, but the wharf on the river with the cellars attached is a strong clue that Arnold was a merchant of some substantial standing, who doubtless made the most of his connections in Germany and London, as well as his official position, to acquire a considerable fortune. The location of this property, adjacent to the Guildhall of the German merchants, shown in the black at the top there, reflected Arnold's combined mercantile and administrative interests. This Guildhall, approximately 10 metres wide and 30 metres long, was built of cast stone, one of the finest medieval building materials. It must have stood as an imposing symbol of both the wealth and influence of London's German mercantile community. This hall would have served as the medieval equivalent of a modern embassy and acted as a centre of German life in the city. It was used for social events and as a hub for merchants, both German and English, to conduct business. Perhaps even it was here that Juliana and Thedmar first met. The Guildhall stood in an area which later became known as the Still Yard, a sort of German enclave in London, which extended 50 metres back from the Thames and 125 metres along its banks. It was about the size of a modern-day football pitch. It's no coincidence that this yard was situated on the Walbrook Street, along which German wine could easily move in barges up to London's Vintry area. The Royal Chamberlain, whose job it was to sequester wine for the royal household, even had an office directly opposite the Still Yard. It's only natural that a merchant of Arnold's standing and the representative of the German merchants in London would choose to live where he did. So Arnold then was a man of considerable wealth and standing in London. He held high municipal office and represented the most privileged group of foreign merchants in the country in England's largest trading centre. He also compiled and composed his wonderful book. Now, like many medieval compilers, he never claimed directly that he was responsible for the production of his book, but the evidence that he did is compelling. In the first place, to produce a chronicle, a writer needs access to source material. As we have seen this evening, Arnold had custody of the city records. Not only would this have facilitated compiling his book, surely it would have acted as an incentive too. Secondly, we have the family history. If Arnold did not write this, or at least cause it to be written, who else could have done? Who else would have known so much of the family history of one man? Who else could have known the hour and day of his birth? Indeed, who else would even have cared? Thirdly, Arnold's chronicle draws to a close in July or August 1274 with preparations for Edward I's coronation. We don't know for sure when Arnold died, but it must have been around this time. His successor as Alderman of Billingsgate Ward, Walmer of Essex, was elected in autumn 1274, and Arnold's own will was granted probate and enrolled among the records of London's Court of Huston in February 1275. In fact, not only does Arnold's chronicle draw to a close in the summer 1274, but Arnold's distinctive hand contributes nothing to the whole of his book after that time either. It seems clear that a month or two before Arnold died, he stopped writing. There is further evidence of Arnold's authorship. Shown in this slide are two images from Arnold's book. As the sharp-eyed among you will have noticed, they are both entered in the same distinctive hand of the late 13th century as a family history. In the image on the right, we can see an entry describing how in 1259 Arnold Fitz Thedmar was deservedly recalled to the king's favour, having previously been wrongfully degraded from his position as alderman. And as you can see right over there, he has even left, helpfully, a marginal note as to the contents of this paragraph, which I've put at the top. In the image on the left, Arnold has copied two royal letters in his favour into his book. These letters ordered his fellow citizens to stop demanding more money by way of tallage and taxation from Arnold, as he had already paid, quote, more than his faculties could bear. In short, what these two images in the family history all show in three different places are variations on a theme. The subject material is the life of Arnold Fitz Thedmar, and in all of those places he is rather keen to point out just what a decent chap he is and how badly treated he often was. If then Arnold was not the author of this book, then the manuscript must have been compiled by someone who had a deep interest in and knowledge of his life. This person must have had access to the same source material that Arnold did. They must have been alive at the same time as Arnold was, and they must have stopped writing at the time that Arnold died. Let us accept then that Arnold compiled this book. What can it tell us about him as a person beyond the dry facts we've already seen? Well, he was certainly a rather haughty man who was no friend to the London mob. In 1259, in one of the most memorable passages of his chronicle, he described the mass city commoners as sons of various mothers, many of whom were born outside of the city and were of a servile condition. In 1263, he criticised the populist mayor, Thomas Fitzthomas, for granting privileges, which Arnold calls abominations, to the craft guilds. And he adds a gloomy marginal note that we can see here, how the little people had power over the magnates of the city. Here. At the mayoral election of 1272, he reported that the alderman complained to the king that the city mob was violently impeding the election of the new mayor, and that the right to elect London's mayor, and indeed sheriffs, solely rested with the aldermen, as they were the head of the body politic and the populace were just the limbs. Just for good measure, he adds that this mob had no land, rents or houses in the city and cared nothing for the city's condition. Alongside his haughtiness, he was also rather touchy. With his aldermanic hat on, he was not afraid to criticise, frequently, everyone from the king down to the mob should they ever dare to disregard London's cherished liberties. On a personal level, throughout his book he frequently complains of unjust treatment at the hands of his fellow citizens. At one point, he even committed to parchment a 1,700-word account of his battles with two of London's mayors over how much he should be taxed. Arnold absolutely wanted to get his side of that story down for posterity. But Arnold was also an intelligent man of extremely wide interests. He presumably spoke at least 4 languages: English, French, German and Latin. That Arnold could read and write French we know from the few French insertions into his manuscript, but he must have spoken it too, for French was the language of the law courts, international trade and the Jewish exchequer, all environments which, as we have seen, were familiar to Arnold. With his German descent, and again as we have seen, position among the German merchants in London, he must have spoken German. And yet when he wrote, Arnold chose Latin, something which makes him unusual among secular civic chroniclers of the time, most of whom wrote in the vernacular. Why did Arnold do this? Was it just force of habit, i.e. that as an alderman of London he daily had to deal with letters and enrolments in Latin and never gave it a second thought? Did he perhaps choose Latin to give his work a permanence? Was it simply easier to choose a language with a settled orthography and grammar? Does it even suggest an element of Arnold showing off, saying, look how cultured I am. I'm not only able to read the Latin letters, documents and charters in my care, but I can even compose in it. Whichever the reason, surely his choice of language speaks to the audience that Arnold had in mind for his book. He certainly did not write this book for the majority of people, those whom he called the fools of the vulgar classes, who could not read Latin. Arnold wrote at the time when the writing of history was ceasing to be the preserve of monks and clerics. Nevertheless, he was probably motivated by many of the same concerns as they were. Monastic chroniclers often wrote to place their institutions in and make sense of the world around them, as well as to defend their institutional rights and privileges. The 13th century was a time when towns across Europe grew in size and importance, and their governance increasingly assumed a corporate institutional form. Arnold absolutely wrote to place London in its rightful position in the realm, and to defend its cherished liberties. In fact, nothing was guaranteed to rattle his cage more than an assault on London's hard-won franchises. True, Arnold's voice in the Chronicle may at times be that of a man defending the interests of a rather narrow governing elite of London, rather than the municipality as a whole, if we all remember his description as the alderman as the head of the body politic. But in the same metaphor, Arnold also referred to the populace as the limbs. Clearly, despite their inferiority to the alderman, Arnold nevertheless perceived them to be part of a single unified body. Of course, Arnold is probably articulating an idealised expectation of what London's civic makeup should be like, rather than the realistic depiction of the reality on the ground, but it is nonetheless valid for that. Arnold must also have been keenly aware of not just London's place and importance in the realm, but also his place in the city. His title of alderman went back to Anglo-Saxon days. So did the name of London's oldest court, which Arnold would have attended on a weekly basis, the Hustin. The tradition of these institutions, the spectacle of civic ritual, along with the more mundane yet nevertheless important day-to-day responsibilities of aldermanic office, they must have made Arnold both conscious of his duties and aware of his own importance. And yet it must have seemed to him at times that all of this was in flux. In 1258, the king was essentially reduced to a cipher by baronial rebels, and from May 1264 to August 1265, the government of the country was effectively in the hands of Simon de Montfort. Urban life was raucous and violent enough at the best of times, but at the time when Arnold was writing, the lower orders of London were pushing for more political power equal to their economic clout. This created tension which frequently exploded in communal violence. Populist mayors who claimed to defend the interests of London's craft workers held office from 1261 to 5 and 1271 to 3, threatening the position of men like Arnold. Indeed, the very nature of his position in London would have only increased the pressure that Arnold was under. As a representative of the German merchants in London, he would have appeared to many, notwithstanding his birth in London, as a foreigner, at a time when, in the words of the author of the Flores Historiarum, all who did not know the English tongue were despised. On the one hand, as an alderman of London, it was his duty to protect the interests of London merchants, particularly against foreign competition. On the other hand, as representative of the German merchants in London, he would have been responsible for maintaining their privileges in an increasingly xenophobic foreign land, At times he must have felt himself being pulled this way and that. It is then no wonder that Arnold can appear to us as rather haughty and prickly. In fact, it was probably a combination of these factors that made Arnold into the writer that he was. At a time of great political uncertainty, Arnold wrote to defend London's institutional liberties. At a time of social turmoil, Arnold wrote to articulate what he thought society should be. And at a time when it must have seemed to him as if the world had turned upside down, Arnold wrote to make sense of the world around him. And we should be grateful for it. For what he wrote was a chronicle of considerable importance, a unique lay source, which provides a civic viewpoint of a tumultuous period. He probably began writing his chronicle at around the same time as his political career began, and as his political career grew, so did the chronicle, and its size and scope to become the fullest account of his time. Arnold's position in London meant that he had access to a great variety of source material, and at times he was more than just an eyewitness, but someone who actually strutted and fretted his hour upon the stage. What he wrote is much more than just a parochial town chronicle. Arnold's interest lay in events as much on the national and international stages as the municipal one. Mercifully free of the supernatural and fantastical, his chronicle instead reflects Arnold's character, intelligent, perceptive and direct, yet touchy, irascible and not a little snobbish. It is an invaluable historical source. Indeed, Arnold's importance as a writer is such that at times he is a unique source for certain events. So, 1263, the Petitio Baronum, which would be incorporated in Henry III's statute against aliens. 3 in 1264, the oath of mutual aid between the rebel barons and the Commune of London. Details of the mines of Lewis. Measures taken to reform the state of the English Church. 1271, the letter of Ilkana Barga to Prince Edward. 1272, Richard of Cornwall's letter on the death of his son Henry of Almaine. Arnold is a unique source for all of these. And there are plenty of other things for which Arnold may not be a unique source, but for which he is by far our fullest, such as the Flemish trade dispute of 1270 to 74. It is no exaggeration to say that without Arnold's chronicle, and indeed book, our knowledge of 13th century politics, society and culture would be poorer. But having lauded Arnold for his qualities as a writer, and commended him for recording events which other chroniclers did not, what I should now like to turn to are some deficiencies in his work. In particular, 4 incidents of which Arnold makes no mention whatsoever. I shall first set out what these episodes were. So the first one came in July 1263. In June, Simon de Montfort and the barons had seized London, and the King and Queen had repaired to the Tower of London. Prince Edward had gone to Windsor Castle. On the 13th of July, Queen Eleanor attempted to flee the tower by boat and join her son at Windsor. She only got as far as London Bridge before she was forced to turn back by a mob of Londoners on the bridge, who shouted insults and pelted her with stones, filth and eggs. The event was recorded by shopwriters at Dover, Pershore, Osney, Dunstable. 5 months later, in December 1263, the King advanced with an army on London and wrote to the citizens ordering them to expel Simon de Montfort and Robert de Ferrers, the Earl of Derby. A group of royalist Londoners allied themselves secretly with the King, and on 11th of December they locked the gate of the city, trapping Simon de Montfort and his massively outnumbered army at Southwark. Simon and his army were only saved by the London citizens, who broke down the gates on London Bridge so they could retreat within the city walls. 6 months later, the Londoners took 3 of those suspected of locking the gates to the Battle of Lewes as hostages, where they were unfortunately slain by rampaging royalists. This event is recorded by writers at Dunstable, Pershore, Osney, St Albans and Dover. In May 1264, on the night before the Battle of Lewes, in an attempt to cause confusion in the city, a royalist Londoner, Richard of Ware, set a fire at Cheapside that caused considerable damage. This was recorded by writers at Osney and Pershore. And then lastly, in October 1264, the papal legate, at that time in France, had attempted to excommunicate the rebel barons, the Londoners, and the men of the Cinque Ports. At Dover, these papal bulls had been seized, torn into pieces and thrown into the sea. The sentence was subsequently published on the 20th of October in Flanders. The best reports of this were provided at Dover, unsurprisingly, Pershore and Osney. Now, to be clear, there is nothing unusual in chroniclers missing some events from their accounts. They were of course only as good as their source material, and their chronicles will only ever be a reflection of their own interests and concerns as much as they will be a comprehensive report on current affairs. It is nevertheless striking that Arnold makes no reference to any of these events at the time. There is, moreover, a pattern here, isn't there? All 4 of these events occurred in a 15-month period between July 1263 and October 1264, when London had firmly thrown its lot in with the rebel barons allied against the king. All 4 are directly concerned with London, and they must have been of interest to a London compiler. The pelting of the Queen from London Bridge, a military skirmish just to the south of the city, a fire on London's Cheapside, and the excommunication of the citizens en masse. So why the silence in Arnold's book? It's not that Arnold was disinterested in events such as these. In fact, Arnold almost always records the publication of sentences of excommunication. The ceremonial solemnity of these occasions really does seem to have made quite an impression on him. Moreover, in 1266, the bishops who had not proclaimed the 1264 excommunication were all published. Arnold certainly records this, and in as fine a piece of humbug as one could hope to find, he absolutely does refer back to the 1264 sentence and then condemns the bishops for their silence at the time. As an alderman of London, it was also one of his duties to keep firefighting equipment and ensure that proper watch was kept in the ward. These omissions simply cannot be a result of disinterest on Arnold's part. These were events of great interest to him and importance both personally and professionally. It would also seem extremely unlikely that Arnold simply did not know about them. We could ask, is it possible that he didn't know about the 1264 excommunication? After all, these sentences were not published in England. I am not so sure. After all, Arnold lived in one of Europe's largest trading centres. It's no coincidence that urban chroniclers like Arnold more often than not wrote in maritime, mercantile centres. These places were busy with people coming and going from far-off lands with news. Even allowing for the disruption of trade during a period of civil war, it is surely inconceivable that not one person brought news to London of the excommunication. Nor was Arnold out of London at this time. In March 1264, he was in town administering the oath of mutual aid between the Londoners and the barons, and in October 1264, he witnessed a land transfer between 2 of his fellow citizens. These omissions cannot have been a result of ignorance, nor can they very likely be attributed to forgetfulness either, because Arnold was actively writing and frequently updating his chronicle from May 1264 onwards. It would also seem unlikely that Arnold made a voluntary decision to protect the interests of people close to him. As we have seen, Arnold was no friend of the London mob. Why on earth would he not record and then stridently condemn their outrageous attack on the Queen? But what if there was more of an involuntary decision to not record these events? Is it at all possible that in fact Arnold was leaned on? Perhaps so. If there is another common theme to this sequence of events, then surely it is this. These were all events that the baronial regime in control of London might well want to hush up. Let's be honest, none of them reflect particularly well on the Londoners, generally, nor on the rebels particularly. The attack on the Queen of England by a mob was so shocking that it is said to have turned Louis IX of France against Simon de Montfort. A royalist fifth column, twice acting in league with other royalists outside of the city, only highlights divisions at the heart of the baronial party. And in papal condemnation of the actions of the Londoners and the barons, backed up with the most serious weapon in the spiritual army of the Pope, confirms their isolation from the wider Christian community. For this theory to be true, however, the implication that Arnold was not in what we might call full editorial control of his chronicle. Is that at all possible? And considering that Arnold never so much as claims authorship of his book, let alone explicitly states why he was writing, how can it ever be proven or refuted? Well, we could turn to one of Arnold's contemporaries. At the same time that Arnold was writing, similar civic annals were being written against a comparable background of communal tension in Genoa. There, in 1264, the civic authorities even went so far as to appoint a committee of 4 men to write the annals. This committee of 4 carefully filtered the information they included in the civic annals, so as to present the municipal government's sanitised and approved version of events. On this committee of 4 was Jacopo Doria, and after a brief hiatus in the continuation of the chronicle, in 1294, he was charged with bringing the annals up to date. Having done that, the annals were then presented to the city governors, who again approved them and had them copied into the city archives. What this interesting contemporary parallel shows is that in at least one other town in Europe, a watchful administration oversaw the writing of an urban chronicle. Was this perhaps also the case in London? Was Arnold being told directly what he could and could not record in his book? Alternatively, I wonder whether there was more of an implicit pressure on Arnold. Was there at this time such a climate of fear that it led Arnold to stay silent on these subjects? Finding evidence of reticence is obviously a tricky business, but there is some evidence of a threatening political atmosphere both during and after the Civil War. In the summer of 1264, a Franciscan legate coming to negotiate with the Montfortian regime had been thoroughly searched upon his landing at Dover and threatened with death if he brought so much as a single letter into the realm against the regime. Writing after the royalist victory at Evesham, the Osney annalist, who was sympathetic to the baronial cause, confessed to leaving material out of his chronicle from the time when the barons held power, saying, "There are many things from this time which we omit from our account for the sake of our readers' peace, because perhaps what may please the royalists may displease supporters of the barons." There are, however, problems with both of these hypotheses. If anyone was going to oversee the production of an official London civic chronicle, or to intimidate an independent writer into silence, one would have expected it to have been the mayor. London's mayor during these years was Thomas Fitz Thedmar, and Arnold is scathing about him and his rabble-raising antics. There is certainly no suggestion that Arnold as a rule held back from criticising Thomas Fitz Thedmar, although it is true that he did add some of his most strident criticism in the years after Fitz Thedmar fell from power. Now, shown here in this slide is Arnold's account of Thomas Fitz Thedmar taking an oath of loyalty to the king in 1265. Arnold wrote the original entry here in April or May 1265. As is clear from the long marginal note, Arnold returned to this entry after he had written it and added something to it, namely, "Then those who were present were able to see a wonder unheard of in this age, because that most wretched mayor, at his oath-taking, dared to utter words of such temerity, saying to the Lord King in the presence of the whole people, 'Lord, as long as you wish to be a good Lord and King to us, we will be faithful and devoted to you.'" Now, whether Thomas said this to the king or not, and I believe he did, what is certain is that Arnold never mentioned it at the time. Perhaps even this incident should be added to our list. So there is, however, another challenge to my thesis. Arnold does not record other events which hardly portray the Londoners in a much better light. Two examples of which are the destruction of the manor of the king's brother, Richard of Cornwall, by a mob of Londoners in March 1264, and the slaughter of 500 of London's Jews during a riot 1 month later. True, the devastation of a royal manor was probably less shocking than the pelting of the Queen's person, and in the eyes of most medieval Londoners there was probably little sympathy for London's Jewish community, but it is still hard to believe that if a censor of some kind was at work, he would not have excised his reports from the record. What is going on here? At first glance, these incidents seem to have much in common. Are these prima facie similarities just superficial, meaningless and misleading? But then are we honestly to believe that 4 such important events in the history of London were missed by a London writer who was in so many other ways a fastidious and conscientious reporter? I suppose that in many ways the answers to these questions depend ultimately on whom we think the audience for Arnold's work actually was. Who was going to read his book? Who indeed could? Remember, it is mostly written in Latin, not French or English. Did Arnold compose this at home or at one of the Guildhalls he frequented? I'm minded to think this was actually much more of a professional rather than a personal venture. His book contained a copy of what would go on to become London's Assize of Nuisance, the Assize of Bread and the Statute of Marlborough. These certainly suggest that his book had an official use. After Arnold's death, someone at Southwark Priory used Arnold's book to compile a chronicle of his own. To my mind, this indicates Arnold's book was well known enough for a compiler elsewhere to seek it out and request it. Would this really have been the case if his book was under lock and key at home? Towards the end of his life, Arnold employed at least 4 scribes to help him actually write the book. Now, I'm sure someone as wealthy and busy as Arnold probably was employed a secretary to help with his workload. But the presence of so many hands says to me that perhaps Arnold had access to a bank of scribes in one of his municipal capacities. Lastly, to this day, Arnold's book is kept among the records of the London Guildhall. It was there in the early 1300s when Andrew Horn was writing. It was there in the early 1400s when John Carpenter was, both of whom made limited use of it. If Arnold didn't write it and then leave it there, it jolly well made its way there pretty soon after his death. Now, I've no doubt that one audience Arnold had in mind for his book was himself. It seems obvious to say it, but it's true nonetheless. He wrote to make sense of the world around him, and because he was genuinely interested in and cared about the things of which he wrote. But there was of course a bigger audience for his work than just himself. This audience cannot have been the vast bulk of the illiterate London populace for whom he cared little. To be honest, if they'd have read some of what he wrote, they would have probably lynched him. He must therefore have written it for people like him, his fellow aldermen, probi homines, and the more discreet citizens, those who could read Latin, those who frequented the Guildhall, those who, like Arnold, were keenly aware and protective of London's importance. Nor was it just for his contemporaries. He also wrote for those who would inherit his book after his demise, for Arnold knew well enough that there is a permanence to the book as a medium of record. If, to conclude, we try to bring this all together, then it leads to a rather thought-provoking conclusion. On the one hand, we could take all 4 or even 5 of these omissions and put them down to chance. We could argue that these were all just random incidents which for various reasons Arnold left out of his chronicle. To my mind, I find that unconvincing. On the other hand, we could say that Arnold omitted these consciously and deliberately, and that these events have enough in common to justify an analysis taking them together. Now, if we accept the second hypothesis, it raises a possibility, but no more than that Arnold was either being pressured or intimidated by others to adapt what he wrote. What is more certain is that at the very least, these omissions show Arnold consciously shaping his narrative, and there is as much evidence of authorial intent as anything which he does include in his chronicle. There is nothing new there. We've already seen this evening how the Osney analyst did much the same thing. The question must then be, for whom was he shaping this narrative? Well, as much as I've shaped this narrative for you this evening, it was shaped for his audience, a select group of his fellow citizens. If we then take that to its logical conclusion, then it would seem that there is a third possibility, which is that Arnold omitted these events from his chronicle because he thought that for whatever reason his audience wouldn't like to either hear or read about them. If that is the case, then if nothing else, these omissions actually tell us as much about the interests, loyalties and sympathies of London's governing class between 1263 and 1265 as they do about Arnold himself.